women could go to school. And as I've worked on a number of historic projects during my time in China, and I realized that I have quite a lot of visual information that shows women in a quite strong position in society. So this is going back to the beginning after the May 1919 movement, which is the first moment of a real idea for democracy and science and new social ideas in China. So you have women going to schools, which was a very important shift. Of course, this coincides with the time when you start to see the rise of communism. And this really has been a very interesting aspect of the development of women in society, because right from the start, women were very much part of this new socialist construct. And you can see here we have this very typical image of women contributing to a war effort, which happens everywhere. The difference is that unlike even in the Western cities, that after the war people would go back to their life, the women were expected to go back to the kitchen or to the home. The women in socialist China were able to, in China, where you have a very strong, coherent force of women students who are protesting different kind of political situations at that moment in time. And here you have again this sort of women taking to the streets from their work unit, where they are protesting the inequalities in society. And this is a very good quote from a correspondent at the time who says that the revolt of women is disinherited masses. And I think that this really is the core of how women were. This is again, and these are very much to do with economic and social issues, where women are very much a force in protesting. So when Mao came in 1949 and New China was established, you have the new constitution, which in the law gives women an equal position with the rights of men. That's political, economic, cultural, educational, and social. And this is something that I think was very important in terms of the law. But of course, changing the cultural habits of people is very much harder. But we have a lot of propaganda, and this is propaganda that comes through the 1950s, the 1960s, often that very much puts women at the fore of the new social changes and shows women to be extremely capable members of society. And these are slogans that were being used between some of the most important campaigns, that there's no difference between men and women in this new age. We can do anything, and anything we can do it well. So I think these really were, even though there was so much trouble during this period of time, but you really see women being a predominant force. So of course this is from the Cultural Revolution, some of the worst turbulence in society, but you have women, this is from an opera called The Red Detachment of Women, being a very powerful force for change. And I think as a result of that, after all of that turbulence, as China began to open up to reform in the 1980s, women want to go back to actually being themselves. And this is something I think that they've been trying to reconcile ever since, this idea of the feminine. What was the feminine after they had been so made androgynous within the kind of the Maoist society? And you see from the 1980s onwards, this very first incidence that you could have plastic surgery and this idea of beauty, which kind of, in a way, puts women back into a social role, which is obviously very complex when you have certain feminine ideals that you wish to stand up to. And this is one of the most important early artists, Yu Hong, and you can see the self-portrait, which is her on your left. And these are portraits of her friends. She became very well known for doing this portrait early on. And they were very radical paintings in their time, but you can see how she sees herself very much as this elegant, beautiful young woman. And here is one of her most radical paintings, which is called The New Generation, which interestingly is a portrait of mostly men. And then she has herself, again, as a very elegant woman. So I think that this is just a quote again about the complicated role of women, having been very active proponents in the society, And then this idea of what is the feminism for women? How are you supposed to be in this new age where women were partly due to a rise in consumerism and materialism, somehow being pushed back into this role of the female, the feminine. And then, of course, this comes to 1989 and the work that you will have seen in this exhibition here, which is, this is already 10 years after the Reform era, and already this idea that women were not capable of forming radical political ideas. And so the image you can see on the right is part of a work that she did later in response to this, where it was her boyfriend who was given the credit for her work. You can see the image here of him at the press conference explaining the work instead of her. And this is a work that she did. It's part of 15 panels where she talks about it taking 15 years to find a way to get her voice back, to reclaim the work that had been hers. So I'm just going to run through some of the other works of women artists who became very well known during the period, and one or two who did take on a kind of feminist stance. This is Liu Hong, who was quite a strong painter of this kind of image through time, and often at a time when it was slightly unpopular that were underlying this role she had to play. And these are some of the paintings she did subsequently, which have actually not really been shown in China because of the, particularly today, ironically, because of this idea of this very strong nudity. Zhang Jie is an artist who from the very beginning has been very concerned with women's role, particularly in this idea of the mother and the requirements for the producing the male child. And this dovetails with another work that's done by Xin Danwen, also looking at the issue of kind of babies, anonymous humans, from a slightly different angle later on. But none of these artists were very comfortable taking on what they considered to be like a radical stance. And I find this very interesting because this is a very new work from Zhang Jie, which was done in 2014, which is an absolute massive kind of penis. And when it was put on, it was just so hard to ignore this idea of this great masculine icon that was put in this exhibition space. And it's a very good example of artists doing something and taking a stance, but actually never really trying to theorize it and radicalize it. But in the context of the people who saw this exhibition, it was very clear. Again, this is a mural work that she'd done of the same thing, similar idea. This is some of Lin Shujin's early work, and I've included some of these works now just to run through because from the very early days, this was a group of artists who emerged in the 1990s who were very keen to align themselves with issues of the day. So they'd already, in a way, stepped beyond specific issues of women or not, and they were focused on what was happening in society. And of course, this is a time where you have issues beginning about the ecology, and we find a number of artists looking at using natural materials and returning to a sense of just basic existence rather than a feminine existence over a male existence. And this is Yin Shujin doing one of her very first presentations as part of a group show in Beijing, and Ran Haiying also in the same exhibition, working with very natural materials to produce works. Lu Qing doing very typical kind of work in a way, which was to do with your own daily experience. So this is every year she would make one roll, and how long the roll would be how much time she had to paint. But this kind of radical work, this involved what was often described as being women's work, became very much an aspect of the women's art in the 1990s. This is Lin Tianmiao. And I've included a few works by Lin Tianmiao because this is very much about women's work. It's the cotton winding for daily objects. And she's very strong in thinking about herself. You can see here that she says, I'm often called a Chinese woman artist, but I would say I am an artist, I am a woman, and I am Chinese. But this is part of the discourse that they all have, which is, I do not need to talk about, I just happen to be female, I don't need to talk about feminism. And this is just to talk about, they're often asked this, and this was particularly highlighted in 1995 when China held the International Women's Conference, which was really a challenging time for all of these artists, and it really showed to me that they had a very strong sense of themselves and their own practice, but they found it very difficult to put that within a theoretical framework. And this is some of Tian Miao's work. You can see very much about women creating that she continues to make. And this was a work that is quite feminist, if you like, because it talks about all the names that women are called across the international scope of language. Hui Ying Chao, who's very much about the experience of her mother, and I think indicates how a lot of women draw on very personal experiences in order to reflect on what it is to be woman. This is Xin Danwen again, thinking about women, women's sexuality, women's control over their own body. And of course this relates very much again to these ideas of the one-child policy, which is a very particular situation for women in China, and gave a very different perspective on being a mother. This is Shang Jing, and I put this in just so that you can get a sense of the scale. Chen Lingyang was a radical artist early on for actually doing work that related to menstrual blood. And it was really interesting at the time to see how often these works, also like Cui Wen, were considered by men to be very titillating, and these women were actually quite attractive. And that was, in some ways, a very difficult thing for them to navigate, because their appeal to what was largely male art historians, male critics, and male curators was very often tied to this very tight network of relationships. This is Hu Xiaoyuan, who's just opened a show in Hong Kong at Taipei, and is making work again very much about human experience. This Duan Jingyu is a beautiful work which does make a play with women's experience, and so what we're coming on to now is a younger generation who have a very different experience, a more global awareness, and I think this shows in the way that they look at women and women's experience, again without a specific feminist framework, but very much thinking about the women's role in society and using all kinds of images to try and usurp the conventions. This is a painter, Liang Wei, who uses images that are very much based around war and the body, which are not often obvious, but you can see here, for Yuji, the body is such an important part. And this probably, Cao Yu is one of the most extreme, most comfortable with herself, being out there as a feminist who speaks about that in terms of the sort of the role she has. And I think probably if we look at the landscape generally, she's one of the very few that can actually speak to what we call a feminist discourse. Tong Wen-ming has become one of the very important artists, but again, of the younger generation, but very much tied with the ecology, with human existence and what humans are doing to the planet. This is a performance artist, Hu Jiayi, who's doing very similar things about existence, and she uses quite a radical approach with the body. And I found this is with Malati, there's kind of an overlap. There's a strong now correlation with awareness of what artists are doing in the Asian region. This is Hu Jiayi in her armor, and how she comes from Xinjiang. And this is the youngest artist I was going to show here, who is able to take a lot of the images. I find now there's a lot of echo across the international region. But I've put these last two images in here because these are only taken around 2000 and 2010. And they really give a picture that even though China has developed hugely, there is an enormous amount of the population, specifically the women, who are in the countryside, who are living very impoverished lives, who are very much outside of this discourse, but appear in it occasionally as subjects of artworks and investigations. And I think that this inequality and this difficulty between the landscape, the country and the urban environments is very much the reason why we have a limitation both on